So Vicki mentioned the R2, so we're going to talk, Mike and I are going to talk about the R2 as well as the companion guides. So the R2, the purpose of it is to facilitate the consistent application of Indiana codes for risk-based closures in Indiana. That sets a framework for characterizing, evaluating risks, and implementing closures if needed. So there's 5 program guides that were developed as companion guides to the R2, which was previously one agency-wide document from 2012 that the R2, I should say the R2 and these program guides were rolled out last year. So we're going to also talk about some of the discoveries we have too. So the 5 program guides are the RCRA, State Cleanup, the VRP, the Institutional Control Program, which is the new program, and then Petroleum Remediation Program. So each of the programs originate from different federal or state regulations and different requirements for each. Again, they're written as companion guides to R2 to be able to manage that program. So the primary changes from the 2012 remediation program guide was the 5 standalone non-real policy documents. Each have similar content and outline. And the new institutional control program we'll talk about later. And then there were some that were removed from the RPG information, which is the Indiana Brownfields program. It was removed, doesn't have a standalone document because Indiana Finance Authority administers that program, and their guidance is on their website. The federal programs, including the Site Investigation Superfund and the Defense Environmental Restoration Program, were removed. They're based on federal law and administrative procedures, and IDEM cannot change those. And then the Excess Liability Trust Fund was removed because it's developed separately. With regard to the individual notable changes to the programs, there was no significant changes to RCRA. As far as the state cleanup guide goes, the petroleum-only sites are now managed under petroleum remediation section, and the independent closure process moved along with that to the state cleanup program. And there's additional administrative guidances that were incorporated in the state cleanup program. The VRP, one of the main things was you have to define the nature and extent within 2 years of executing your VRA, which is a voluntary remediation agreement. And you have an annual report that's required now, and that's also true for the state cleanup. And there's more frequent billing that the client or the responsible party should be expecting, mainly at milestones at the project. So it brings us to the Institutional Control Program Guide, the new program. There was previously no agency-wide document that managed the institutional controls. It really managed the process to develop, track, and maintain the institutional controls, which include environmental restrictive covenants, environmental restrictive ordinances, and the long-term stewardship. Provides information on how to develop, maintain, and track these controls. So that brings us to the Petroleum Remediation Guide. It's broken down in 2 main guidance: the leaking underground storage tank and certain other petroleum releases program, also known as the Petro program. So LUST, a lot of you guys are familiar with that. It manages the regulated USTs. The spill rule was repealed. The Indiana Code spill rule was repealed. It now follows the Code of Federal Regulations 40 Part 280.5. If you have a release, you're required to report it within 24 hours. And confirmed releases are whether you have product or based on laboratory analysis. Release classification has not changed, high, medium, and low. However, the high, which is unacceptable exposure to release-related chemicals, which is a new term that the R2 uses, what used to be compounds of concern, is the science service team is assigned to that project, as well as, like Vicki mentioned, there is going to be a required meeting to develop a path forward for that site. If you have a change in the priority status, you must notify IDEM within 24 hours. So risk evaluation under the petroleum remediation program, you have that's risk evaluation needs to be done prior to submitting a corrective action plan, and after you have the site properly characterized. Then your remedy selection is based on the risk evaluation and the risk exposures. Initial site characterization, everybody's in the room has probably heard of those. Those were required for all incidents previously. Now it's only required for the high priority sites. The reports for the lower or medium, other reports such as a less investigation, a simple report would be adequate. The laboratory, full QA/QC level 4, used to be required for characterization and closure. It's no longer required. And then that brings us to the second part of the petroleum remediation program, the Petro program. It manages releases that do not originate from a regulated UST. Any petroleum release not originating from a regulated UST may include like orphan tanks that's found during construction, the heating oil tanks, spills of 55 gallons or more, or if you have water sheen impacts to the water, and then a petroleum spill that may be identified that's never had a spill response completed. The Petro programs is subject to the Indiana spill rule, which requires a 2-hour reporting when detected, and the PRS, the Petroleum Remediation Section, will recover cost for management of these releases. So I mentioned independent closure process is now under the petroleum remediation program. It describes it's got a non-real policy document describing the ICP approach. Investigation or remediation on these sites has to be completed by an environmental consultant. Requirements to be within the ICP is you got to be within, the release has to be within your property boundaries or adjacent right-of-ways. Free product has to be removed. And then requirements for closure of the approval is implementing the institutional controls, submittal of the IC completion form, and then submittal of a complete and accurate closure documentation. So this is just a summary of similarities and differences. Don't think I need to go through all of them. Release reporting's different, one from federal, one the state, and the ICP being now in the Petro program. So that's the guidance document summarized. Now we're going to go in, Mike and I are going to go into the R2 highlights and what we've kind of found over the course of the last year. We're going to talk about the published levels versus the old remediation closure guide screening levels, and who needs to use the R2 after July 8th, 2022, which it was adopted and rolled out. And then what about transitioning pre-existing sites? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about vapor guidance, a couple of highlights of elimination of vapor exposure groundwater screening levels, and then more sampling is going to be required and expected. Should expect that. Then we're also going to talk about the contained in and uncontaminated soil policies, how R2 addresses those or how they don't, and then what's it mean for one of your sites or your clients. So in general, IDEM did not grandfather any sites in any pre-existing sites. So after the July 8th, 2022, most all were required to transition to the R2. However, if your site was at the cusp of closure, it could stay within the RCG. There may be some sites still in that category based on some of the speed that Vicki had talked about. Probably some are still there. That brings us to the R2 published levels. Those replaced the former screening levels. Published levels are a concentration of a risk-related chemical in a particular medium which is acceptable for a specified exposure scenario, whether it be residential, commercial, excavation, construction worker scenario. No changes for soil published levels includes there's no long-term residential, commercial direct contact screening levels for VOCs. There's only short-term for the excavation / commercial or construction worker scenario. That's because the expectation that VOCs are going to volatilize at the surface, at the point of contact, and also attenuate quicker when exposed. And there's also no migration of groundwater screening levels in the R2. They are pushing for groundwater analysis and or vapor screening that Mike will talk about here shortly. The groundwater published levels, there's an elimination of the vapor exposure groundwater screening levels or published levels. And there's more chemicals added, including the PFAS, which John Young hopefully be able to hit on at the end of the day, and then some updated levels. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike. He's going to talk about vapor intrusion.
Thanks, Brian. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is a conceptual diagram of what we consider to be vapor intrusion. So you have a source of contamination down here, and that as the volatile chemicals volatilize, they migrate up through the ground surface trying to get to the atmosphere, and during that path they are pulled into basements or pulled in through utility conduits off the side, and once they're in the residence, they get drawn in there because what we call stack effect, or the wind blowing over the top of the structure. And this ultimately creates a health risk inside the residence, and that's some of the things that the state is looking at to avoid that health risk. So just to kind of get you guys on the same page. So as Brian said, soil gas screening is now kind of something that IDEM's using more frequently because we've removed some of these soil levels to look at. So in general, they require you to look at like 3 soil gas samples and be as close as possible to the source, like say groundwater. So at one site, we had to collect 5 soil gas samples next to 5 wells that had CVOC hits, just to prove out. Luckily, they were all non-detect, so and this was part of a negotiation we were having with the regulator at the time. So let's see, in a due diligence scenario where you're looking at a phase 1, for instance, you may find that an adjacent business within 100 feet of yours, if they have an exceedance of a soil gas level of these permissible levels, then you're going to have to look at VI on your own property. With regards to petroleum sites, typically these aren't looked at, but IDEM is going to look at these on a case-by-case basis based on if you have NAPL present, the depth of groundwater, if you have odors, and based on kind of soil thicknesses. Let's see, what else? Conduit sampling, that's kind of a new one this year. KERAMIDA has been looking at it for over 10 years. We've found it to be a pathway, and luckily the state has finally come around to that same position. So now we're looking at sampling in conduits and sampling outside the conduit. So one would be in the pipe and one's outside the pipe. We have just in city here, we've had to do sewer sampling to assess that as a vapor migration pathway, and we've had to look at it multiple times just to prove to IDEM. As part of that, we've also kind of looked at different sampling techniques. The typical way you do soil gas sampling is with what we call a SUMACAN, which is TO15. There's also a method called TO17, where we have an absorbent media, which allows you to do a more long-term sample. So instead of having something that, say, is like a SUMACAN does either an 8-hour or 24-hour sample, the TO17 sample you can do anywhere from a week up to as much as maybe a month. So we've kind of looked at these 2 devices. One's called the Beacon sampler and one's called the WMS sampler. And we've had some significant results. One of them was very different on chlorinated compounds. So we're kind of working with IDEM to say, hey, we kind of like these long-term samples to get a more average concentration versus just a quick snapshot. Let's see, so as I said, IDEM's now looking at vapor migration in conduits as one of their primary pathways to kind of assess risk above groundwater going into a residence or a building. If you have a vapor intrusion problem, one of the things you probably are likely to do is install a vapor mitigation system. These are typically done using a radon type system where you have what we call a sub-slab depressurization system. If you have one of those put on, IDEM is now going to require you to do indoor air sampling and also what we call performance testing, where you're going to do something, pressure field extension testing, where you have to test below the slab, kind of that you have vacuum extending below the limits to show that you have captured vapors. That's now going to be required. Under this new program, you're still allowed to use the upper confidence level, but you have to have 8 worst case samples, and IDEM defines worst case as closed building conditions, which are either collected in the winter when you're running your heating and stuff like that, and we have something occurring called stack effect, or in the summertime when you're air conditioning and you have another closed condition. These we define as worst case, and they generally want you to sample at least winter and summer. For sampling, they generally want quarterly events over a 1-year period with a minimum of 3 samples per event. And I always just talked about worst case. So on this image, I'm trying to show you some of the new classifications that IDEM has. You'll see we have, obviously to the left, we have the regular indoor air, residential, commercial, like we've talked about. And as you move towards the right, you're going to see the soil gas and conduit vapor levels. We have this subdivided into what we call shallow and deep, at least in some sense, with regards to soil gas and with regards to conduits. And then we also have a column for large commercial, which is something completely new in R2. And these are all kind of based on attenuation factors. Like previously in RCG, we had indoor air levels, and then we had to use an attenuation factor to determine a subslab value. Now they've at least published these subslab values, but they've also broken it up into all these various columns, so you can look at your specific scenario and try to assess how your data looks or how your site looks for planning next steps. And as down below, you'll see one of these lower bullets. IDEM now has matrices in the back of the R2 that allow you as a consultant or as a client to review. I've got an indoor air data above my indoor level. I've got a subslab above my commercial levels, and it will prescribe to you what you have to do for mitigation and or monitoring and or kind of a long-term sampling plan. Those are all very called out specific, and these were previously in non-rule policy documents, and now they're part of the R2. IDEM now has an action level where it's 10 times the screening level, which prompts immediate action, but prompt action is not defined in the guidance. So let's see. So I talked a little about conduit and outside conduits. That's kind of what you see up in here. And these are all based on different attenuation factors. So like I said, but the chart helps you out. You'll see over here to the right, with the RCG, under R2, we now have a value of 9. Previously, it was 8.8. In most cases, IDEM rounded up all the values, as I'll show in the next slide. So this is kind of what the screening table looks like in the guidance document. As you can see, everything's now in scientific notation. Everything's been rounded up to 0.00, which makes it tough to read because you got to convert it based on all the the decimals behind it. I think that is it for me.
Just a couple more slides. We'll talk about the contained in and uncontaminated soil policies. When this was R2 was rolled out, those two were obviously missing from the guidance document from the R2. IDEM has continued to use the previous RCG screening levels for evaluation of the two programs. We contacted IDEM after the R2 came out. We've contacted them a couple other times recently. They're still working on updates, but they provided us no timeline. So what's all this mean to you and maybe your clients? So the initial assessments are going to be more important than ever, more comprehensive. You should expect an increased assessment cost for VOC sites specifically, because the VOC, you're going to do more sampling, plus the VI samples are about 3 times higher than a soil or groundwater sample, 60 compared to 180 roughly. The PFAS and PFOs are here. Hopefully, John, we have time for John Young to give you a little summary of the regulatory status of those at the end. You got multiple compounds are listed in the published levels. And is this business as usual? We found it to be yes. It's because most everything was in place. It was just different guidance documents that we had to go to. And now everything's in one. All of it's in the R2 plus the guidance documents that the companion guides. So that really concludes our presentation. Hopefully you guys don't have to use it.